Hello and welcome to the September 19th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. I will start out with this episode with some announcements. The first is that we have restarted our project, Radio Free America. Romeo is taking point on that one and has done the latest episode solo, so you can go to, I'll link it in the description. The podcast is on a separate feed, so look it up for Radio Free America. Keep in mind, we're not the only people who thought of that name. There are a few not so great projects that share that same name, so make sure that it is the one that has mine and Romeo's name on it. It is attached to the same Patreon, so if you'd like to support Radio Free America as well as Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. I've also been pretty active with NV in this last week in particular. I put out an explainer. It will be on a similar topic I'll cover in this episode, the drone attack on Poland that Russia launched about a week ago, and I delved into how it is far from the first time that Russia has attacked a NATO country in one way or another. I go through the various assassinations, sabotage. Just recently, there was an investigation that showed how Russians were putting bombs in packages. Yes, while this was, in fact, a big deal, it was not the first time that Russia did anything like this, and that was one video. And I also recently interviewed the incoming Cypriot ambassador. There's some interesting things coming from Cyprus, and that will be an article I'll be putting out next week or so. So keep an eye on New Voice of Ukraine, and to support New Voice of Ukraine, you can go to patreon.com/NVUA. And on to the show. So first up is, of course, our battlefield updates, and the situation around Pokrovsk has been getting interesting, to say the least. The first thing that we can say is there is presently a major buildup in the Pokrovsk direction. I mentioned it last time, but it is ongoing, and various analysts have predicted that there will be a fall offensive or an offensive coming up sometime soon, that they have been pulling resources away from other fronts in order to prepare for. So we're all on our toes seeing what is going to happen in that direction. Right now, it is one of the largest buildups that they've done throughout the entire course of the war already, and it is continuing. Their effort to break through to Pokrovsk, which really began at the end of last year, and now we're entering into the fall of this year, this would be in fact a third offensive that they would be making onto the city. But we know that there are large amounts of armor assets that they have already begun to use, which has been unusual since the early days of the invasion, though at present, the attempts to begin using armor, to begin using more vehicles, has been a bit of a disaster. We have seen this in a few different locations around the front, the increased use, or at least preparations for use. It seems like they're trying to figure out what they can do with them more than anything else. And it's been not going very well. There is the drones. That is the number one thing going on in all the fronts right now. We know that the presence of drones, the increased efficiency of drones, increased deadliness of drones, have turned the entire front, especially the Pokrovsk area of the front, into what I've heard of various frontline reporters, various analysts describe as a new phase of this war, where I'm not going to belabor it so much because I began talking about it in previous episodes, but I've just been hearing more and more about this, so it does have to get off my chest. But the extreme deadliness over an increasingly large no man's land, it's scary. It's very, very scary. And on that point, this northern advance to get around Pokrovsk, an update on that, of course, last time we talked about it, we were talking about how there was at least one encirclement that had occurred in this northern advance around Pokrovsk towards Dobropilia. Now I'm hearing it could be as many as 3 encirclements. So this northern advance is being cut up extremely effectively. So some of the more pessimistic things I was saying about Pokrovsk a few months ago, especially at the beginning of this Dobropilia advance, did not turn out as badly as I thought it would. But that said, with a lot of these maps are becoming increasingly, I don't want to say unreliable, because the makers of various maps, Deep State, for example, have been describing the difficulties of what they are doing. They're being very open. They're not trying to present themselves as an objective version of the truth, but I do have to tamp down on some of the overenthusiasm of what we are seeing in this area, and that is a lot of the positions that are being shown on maps as being held are maybe held briefly, held with not a very large force. This whole area of the Dobropilia bunny ears, some people called it because it was two extensions upward. A lot of it is this amorphous blob of positions and very unknown gray zone. Where, yes, we are seeing the positionality of the various Russian advances cut off, put in worse positions, but it's still, in wrestling terms, a scramble, and there is no good information about what is happening at any given kilometer in this area. It is dense, dense, dense fog of war and is changing very often. So don't treat it as solid lines on the map so much as an approximation of a median of where positions may be. This reality of the drones, this reality of how much contested space there is, we are seeing the early phases of that in Prokrovsk, and it will become more the case in other parts of the front line as well, wherever there is more activity. And speaking of a different part of the line where there is more activity, we have to go to Kupiansk, and the situation there is degrading. Previously, the Russians had begun to enter Kupiansk from the north. They are now also entering it from the northwest, and the gray zone is extending into more and more of the city. So while the Russian attentions have been taken away from Sumy, and in fact, Ukraine has retaken a lot of the territory that the Russians had taken in Sumy, including a few encirclements that were quite disastrous for the Russians, Kupiansk is still a priority for them. It's not just Pokrovsk, so please keep our eyes on Kupiansk as well. But to talk about this drone attack that Russia did on Poland about a week ago, I do want to point you at the video I made for NV about that. I did put that on the Patreon. I did not paywall that or anything. I'll also be linking that in the description for the full video, but a shorter version of what I did there. This drone attack that Russia launched had 21 drones. Of them, only about 4 were shot down. So right off the bat, we see that the Poles were not prepared for this. Their air defense was not good. It was really based around the idea that any drone that is coming to Poland is just going to Ukraine, so they don't have to worry about them too much. And yeah, the Russians have flown drones into Poland before. Some of them have crashed, but most of the time they turn around and go back into Ukraine, which allows the Poles to get lazy. And as much readiness that Poland may be going through, as we see, they are not ready, which made it all the more frustrating for different NATO officials. Not going to single out any one of them because there are a lot making these same statements of how this shows that NATO airspace is defended well enough, how we are ready for anything, yada, yada, yada. No, this was a catastrophe. This drone attack that Russia did was deliberately designed in order to test what NATO airspace, what it takes to get through it. And the answer was not good. The Russians learned that they could do this more, and the fact that even now there is not going to be any no-fly zones or anything like that extended over Ukrainian territory means that the Russians didn't even get really a negative response. And where the Russians are able to sense weakness, where they see that their enemies are not responding in a way that stops them, they'll continue, which is what they've done for decades as a meta point, I suppose. But in this exact instance, they got a lot of good information. It turned out very, very well for them, and people need to stop acting like this was some kind of success because it was not. So of course there'll be more, and more, and more, and more. They'll keep poking until they meet resistance. That's always how it happens. I don't know why this hasn't gotten through to the right people yet. Where Russia pokes, if there's resistance, they usually stop. But where they poke and it's soft, they keep going. Oh, so very, very frustrating seeing how the West is not getting it through their heads of how they have been under attack for years and they've just allowed it to happen. In this video that I went over how some things that we've covered on the podcast at different times, how the GRU units have taken part in the assassination of the Skripals, how they This was actually one of the episodes we made right before the full-scale invasion, how they had blown up these arms warehouses in Czechia and a few other countries that had weapons that were intended for Ukraine. And it was known it was Russia. It was known that Russia blew things up in NATO countries and killed people, and nothing was done about it. They burned down a mall in Warsaw. They, like I said in the intro, they are behind these mail bombs that are going in planes. NATO isn't at war with Russia, but Russia's at war with NATO. Anyway, watch the video. It was a good video. One thing the Poles did react to, however, was the Zapad 2025 exercises. Zapad meaning West. This was a joint military exercise by Russia and Belarus, though also with observers and even participants from India. India sent 65 soldiers, and we'll get more into some of the closer connections that are happening between India, Russia, and China when we talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But in this case, there were Indian troops doing military exercises with Russian ones and Belarusian ones, as well as from a couple of African countries as well, Burkina Faso, Congo, and then with observers from a bunch of other countries. These exercises always have observers at them. I think a little bit too much was made about the presence of an American observer there. That is fairly routine, though I think that the way that the American observer conducted himself there, or at least the US government presented their presence there, allowed for more whitewashing to happen than should have been done. But that's kind of par for the course for this government at this point. These exercises were not especially interesting, to be honest. Only 13,000 troops took place, which is quite small by the standards of, the big Russian military exercises, especially compared to Zapad 2021, which I'll get to that in a second. There were some more worrying things that Russia did, such as deploying Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad being the region of Russia that's separate from the rest of it. It is nestled in between Poland and Lithuania, completely surrounded by NATO space, and has been the launching point for a lot of electronic warfare. For example, going back to my Envy video and the idea of how Russia continuously attacks NATO, Kaliningrad is where they have their electronic warfare devices that are used to disrupt navigation in the Baltic Sea area. But moving on. As always, the plan that we saw was that Russia would, in the event of a war with NATO, which is always presented indirectly, that's how these military exercises always work. It's obvious what the war they're preparing for is, but they'll just, out of, kayfabe, I suppose, always pretend like it is something else, some fictional scenario. But the goal, as always, used their troops in Belarus and Kaliningrad to close the pincer through the Sokoli corridor, this area in between Kaliningrad and Belarus that is also the border between Poland and Lithuania. By doing this, they'd be able to cut off the Baltic states from the rest of NATO and be able to destroy them independently while NATO tries to rush in troops to protect it. The idea throughout all kinds of military exercises is that in the event of a war between Russia and NATO, Russia would be able to move fast enough to kill a lot of people in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, while NATO tries to hurry their way towards the Baltic states. That's just how it's understood it will be. History has a lot of examples of wars not going as are planned, but that's the assumption. So yeah, it's not very large. People got worried about parts of it, such as the deployment of the missiles in Kaliningrad. But really, what freaked people out was the fact that the last time they had these exercises, Zapad 2021, it was very obviously the preparation for the invasion of Ukraine. It showed that Russia had full access to the use of Belarus. Russia was able to deploy a lot of the preparations needed for an invasion of Ukraine to Belarus as well as around the Russian borders, and just left a lot of that there. So for months before the full-scale invasion, the Russians had been getting ready for it while pretending as though they were just military exercises. Though Zapad 2021 was much, much larger. I think like 10 times larger then this most recent Zapad exercise, it's not as though they expected the same thing to happen from this one as from last one, but that is why the Poles deployed a large military contingent onto their border with Belarus, as well as closing off their border with Belarus entirely, leading to some complaints from China, seeing as how the Belarus-Polish border is an important route for a lot of intercontinental land-based trade, so that led to some complaints. But Poland did a show of force to say that what happened to Ukraine would not happen to them, because they were immediately deploying to stop anything. Meanwhile, in the Baltic states, again, they know what the future would hold if there is a war, and the Baltic Defense Zone, this border between especially Latvia and Estonia with Russia, has become increasingly fortified with various like anti-tank measures, etc. But one more bit of news about the Russians that I think a lot of people who got used to, Kremlin watching, to trying to figure out what is going on in Russian politics will find pretty fascinating, though this individual is not talked about so much in the West, so I don't know how familiar everyone may be with Dmitry Kozak. Kozak is, by his name, you might be able to guess, himself a Ukrainian. He is from a town in central Ukraine that I'm actually in Uman right now for the Jewish New Year. Just going to be here for a few days, not going to be here for Jewish New Year itself, Rosh Hashanah. But I do like to come a few days beforehand where it's a bit more doable, cheaper, etc. But that's beside the point. He's from a town in Ukraine, not far from where I am now in Uman, about I think less than an hour away from here. And yeah, ethnic Ukrainian, he understands Ukraine better than most people in the Kremlin. However, early in his life, after his military service, he moved to Russia. Then it was all the Soviet Union. But after his military term, he eventually, after a bit, no need to belabor his biography too much, ended up in St. Petersburg, or at the time Leningrad, went to university in Leningrad, and spent most of the rest of his time in Leningrad, then St. Petersburg, when the name changed. And it is his time in St. Petersburg where he served in the St. Petersburg city government, just like Vladimir Putin. Now, I dived a bit more into this with another video I made for NV about Dmitry Medvedev, but many of Putin's most important, closest, most trusted advisors come from his time in the St. Petersburg mayor's office. Putin was there with Medvedev, he was there with Kozak. So this is someone who, again, very much trusted by Putin, though most of the rest of the Putin inner circle didn't like Kozak as much. He was always the odd man out. And the period in his career where he was the most odd man out came with the invasion of Ukraine. Dmitry Kozak was apparently the only dissenting voice when it came to invading Ukraine. When they had their meeting the day before the full-scale invasion to decide if they're going to go through with it, inside sources in Moscow say that he was the only vote no, again in Putin's inner circle, because again, he knew Ukraine the best out of all of them. He saw that this probably wouldn't go as well as others assumed it would. He was the Ukraine guy to Putin when it came to integrating Crimea into the Russian Federation, not just formally annexing them, but connecting them more to the state apparatus within Russia, and Crimea was much more attached formally to Russia itself than any of the other illegally occupied territories, and Kozak was the person who took care of the technicals of how that would go through. Fast forward to the full-scale invasion, and in the immediate before term of the full-scale invasion, apparently he was the one who was able to make some kind of deal with the Ukrainian government and got the Ukrainian government to say that if you promise not to invade Ukraine, we will agree not to join NATO. Because Putin was saying it was all about the threat of NATO expansion. So if Ukraine gave up the hope of NATO expansion, then Russia would back off. That turned out not to be the case because Putin was lying. He lies about things. It's not about NATO. But anyway, I'm getting too adrift from Kozak here. So Kozak made that deal. Apparently, after the immediate invasion. He is the one who called up Kiev and said, it's time to surrender. Our army is barreling down on Kiev right now, at which point, apparently it was Andrei Yermak who basically swore at him and hung up the phone. That is apparently the story. I don't know how true that is. And most recently, in August, apparently, Kozak is the one who said that Russia should give up on the war right now and try to negotiate some kind of settlement, something that Putin and the rest of his team was not interested in. There has been some signs, at least, of growing economic unease around the war, various business leaders not liking the directions that some of these indicators are going in and are hoping to get a pause in the war, an armistice, not actually give up anything, but at least freeze the conflict to the best of their ability so the Russian economy can catch up, which is not the case, but that was Kozak's idea to happen. And just now, just learning this today anyway, he has resigned. The sole member of, I'm not going to say the peace camp, but the pragmatist camp anyway, in Putin's inner circle is now gone. And not just because of his formal position, any formal positions he may have, none of that matters in Russia. He's a man that Putin trusts, and he was the only man that Putin trusts that was trying to avert the war, not out of I'm not going to try to romanticize him or treat him as a good guy. Obviously, he is one of Putin's main men. He's not a good guy. He has still carried out his duties in relation to this war. He has not tried to end the war, but his voice has been one for restraint and pragmatism. The only voice for restraint and pragmatism. Even if that was not listened to, it's now gone. And more importantly, he saw a reason for it to be gone. So anyone still talking about the possibility of negotiations, of Ukraine just going to the peace table, this to me is one of the strongest arguments for why that cannot be the case. Because the only person of any power in Russia who believed it could be the case resigned. He's gone. And there's no one else left like him. This next segment of the show will do a lot with diplomacy and power blocks and things like that. But before I get too deep into any of this, I do want to make some comments about some recent gains for the Ukrainian side as far as diplomacy is concerned. So this is not all negative. Like, there have been some serious gains that are made. Ukraine is moving closer with its European partners. There have been increasing agreements, for example, to open up Ukrainian-owned factories within the European Union is something that I'm very bullish about. One of these is that the EU Parliament is opening up an office in Kyiv. Now, there are, of course, plenty of international organizations that have offices in Kyiv. It's not unique in that way. There is ongoing dialogue between Kyiv and the European Parliament, regardless of a direct office being there. These kinds of things are mostly symbolic, but diplomacy is all about empty symbolism. And having an office, having a staff, having people working directly with Kyiv organizations, government offices on a persistent basis, that is the stuff that politics are made out of, is about these direct relationships. It is about this constant communication that only comes from direct presence. So having this office here will be a major boon. These offices also tend to bring funding opportunities with them. So I'll say that's also a positive that will come out of it. Similarly, Ukraine has recently ratified a 100-year partnership with the United Kingdom. Most important part of this partnership is that it will come with a significant amount of military aid, with 3.6 billion pounds promised up until 2030. But really, it has all kinds of provisions that deal with basically everything you can think of, from energy to defense, of course, to things such as scientific and cultural cooperation. And like I said with this EU office idea, yes, these specific points are very important. Having this money pledged is very important. Having these programs opened up, but when they make it a 100-year partnership, that signals something a bit deeper than the direct bureaucratic aspects of this. Presuming, of course, that any future governments decide to honor their agreements. And the way the world is turning out, it seems as though certain members of the populist right political parties in the United States, but also Europe, are turning against the idea of honoring their commitments. But presuming things don't go that badly in the UK, and I do worry, this is a long-term generational pledge that will result in people literally growing up with these programs existing, institutional, rooted ties being made, which comes with an adoption of culture, of mindset that makes these more specific and direct partnerships blossom, because you never know. You never know what grows out of this garden. And if you look at the development of things such as the European Union, they didn't just sprout up out of nowhere one day. It was a continuous process of ever closer ties until something like the EU became a fait accompli. It became just the next logical step of what had already pre-existed in these other organizations that were like it. And as Ukraine tries to join NATO, it'll already have all these pathways already there. The way that Sweden and Finland were able to join NATO so quickly is because they were already attached to NATO countries so directly anyway, in non-NATO agreements, but in other lower scale but still substantive ones. So yes, I'm very happy about a 100-year partnership agreement and what can come of it. I guess now time to go back to the pessimism with our next segment on the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, September 1st in Tianjin, China. And again, dealing with this idea of soft diplomacy and building relationships, this meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I do have something planned to talk about this in more detail, so keep in mind that this future episode is coming more about Chinese multipolarism, but on the softer side of things, we did see much warmer relationships personally between Russia's Putin, China's Xi Jinping, and India's Modi. They're all smiles and hugs, and wow, those personal relationships we know are not as cozy as they made them look like. They made the decision to make them look that way. It's politics. What they feel in their souls is not that important. It is what they choose to show to the world, which is more important. And this increased trend of India drifting more towards the China, I don't know if I want to call it the China-Russia axis, because it really is just China, with Russia hoping to gain from it. But Narendra Modi making himself more a part of this, it was pretty obvious that would be the case. As we recently talked about, there was a very brief moment where Trump was beginning to talk more tough on Russia and promising that anyone who was still trading with Russia would face these secondary sanctions, and there'd be great, global trade war to constrain Russian economic activity anyway, with India being a major buyer of Russian oil. And really the only thing that came out of that was punishing India with these secondary sanctions and then immediately talking soft on Russia again, making the entire point of these secondary sanctions completely worthless. The way I commented on it last time was Washington and Moscow were finally looking like they were having a conflict, and the only person to actually suffer for it was India. But because of that, India has begun to view the US as untrustworthy, which is, this is such a major error within this whole relationship of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, of that the Brazil, India, South Africa parts are not exactly bought in on having an entire revisionist world order and have been working just fine with the United States. The United States and India have a very deep relationship with each other. That relationship could have been used more effectively to drive a larger wedge between China and Russia, possibly, but no, doing things intelligently is not what the US does. So instead, just told India to pick the other side. And I strongly dislike Narendra Modi. He is the butcher of Gujarat. He is this crazy ultra-nationalist weirdo, but the realpolitik perspective, could have kept India on side, actively chose not to, and now Modi is talking about his best buddy in the world, Putin. Beyond that, we had Hungary and Slovakia show up to this meeting in what is mostly in a pan-Asian organization. The root of it is China, of course, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Most countries, most Asian countries are a part of it, not all, but it's seen as a very Asia-centric forum. Plus, I guess now Hungary and Slovakia leading to rebukes from especially the Polish government asking why they are appearing with the enemy. But thankfully, I made that Hungary episode that has all my complaints about Hungary nice and bundled up inside of it, so just see that for insert anti-Orban rant here. But yeah, everything's all lovey-dovey, all these world leaders taking their pictures together. And like I said with the previous segment talking about how these relationships really are the core of politics and it cannot be ignored. But at the same time, if they're presenting these meetings, if they're presenting these international partnerships as they called it, a new global order, we have yet to see anything that would actually be what that order would consist of. A new global order would have to deal with new financial systems, new security systems, new formats of dispute resolution. Not every conflict in the world is a big contracted war. There is international legal mechanisms that handle smaller scale things. And China, Russia, and the others, they're not presenting an alternative. They're not presenting an alternative to a World Trade Organization, an IMF, it's for the laws of the sea, anything like that. They're not presenting what global governance is made out of. It's only these interpersonal relationships. So please keep that in mind. If they were to be serious about this, again, quote, new global order, what is that global order supposed to be other than personal relationships between dictators? We haven't seen it. So that would be one thing to keep in mind here, where a lot of the news coverage has talked about how China is gathering the global south together to challenge the West. Not without a new version of the IMF, you aren't. Not without a new way of stabilizing international currencies, you're not. It's all talk. Talk is important. Talk is politics. Relationships are politics. But you don't replace a global order built over the course of decades on photo ops. You just don't. That said, these photo ops are becoming more common. Right now, there is the Zhongshan Forum. This is more security oriented, whereas the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was more broad based. This new Zhongshan Forum, I don't speak Chinese, I'm sorry. I said that best I could, is more focused on these security issues. Again, ongoing right now. In October, there will be the Russia-Arab Summit, where a bunch of Arab leaders, including the new Syrian government, will be present in Russia for it. So there is a very concerted effort to make these conferences be an alternative to those such as the G7. The G7 being basically the major Western countries, plus Japan, that has often presented itself as the most important people meeting to make decisions about the world. And that is the kind of thing that Russia and China are currently offering an alternative to. But what all these meetings amount to other than relationship building, again, to repeat myself for the millionth time, relationship building is still important. What is happening besides that is still unclear, but that will be how I will announce a new project I'm working for with Ukraine Without Hype, is that I will be doing a multi-part series. I'm calling it the Global Polycrisis, about how all the world's problems are related to each other. This will be a multi-part series on international conflict, on how the Western world order is dropping the ball, how China, especially with Russia as a junior partner, is trying to create an alternate world, what they call the multipolar world order, which in fact is anything but from China's perspective, where I will go into more detail about this idea of multipolarism, about how everything that we know about how the world is stitched together and have known about it for the last 30 plus years, if not going back to World War II, is in a state of utter collapse, and how the United States government is actively bringing about that end. In series two-part, it will be interspersed with news episodes, other things that come out of Ukraine Without Hype. It will not be week after week after week of just this series. It will be interlaced with other things, so that will carry us a couple, like maybe 2 months into the future. This will be spread out over. Coming soon. This segment now is one that was emotionally taxing to take notes on and figure out what to say for. Though living in Ukraine, reporting on Ukraine, knowing people on the front line, a former colleague that I worked with was just announced as being killed on the front line, actually, Kostya. But even still, but even with the constant horrors that we are accustomed to, this story was still very depressing, even by my standard. And that was the murder of Iryna Zarutska. Everyone knows about this by now. It was the biggest Ukraine-related story, at least as far as coverage in the American media goes, probably since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, unfortunately, and for very unfortunate reasons. So this murder took place on August 22nd in Charlotte, North Carolina. Iryna was a refugee there. She went to art school, was in Kyiv during the siege, though she fled before eventually ending up in Charlotte, where she was on the bus, and a man who was severely schizophrenic and was talking about how Iryna was reading his mind, stabbed her from behind, at which point she very quickly bled out and died. There are many things about this story that were disconcerting. One is, of course, the fact that this was all caught in camera, and we can always talk about how I think that there's a bit too much gore in the news. I saying this as someone who watches a lot of drone footage and has seen viscera in person from the war, but not everyone should. I don't think it makes you especially more informed to see these death videos. I think someone can tell you what it is, and it is the same information. I think that there is a lot of gawking that happens. Some of it has been instrumentalized for good use. The Magyar Birds, one of the most effective drone units in the Ukrainian military, has gained a lot of fame from posting their videos of hitting Russian targets. I'm not going to lie and act like I don't enjoy those videos. But for a normal person, I don't think that watching this video of Iryna being stabbed and fading away from life improved your mindset in any way. In fact, quite the opposite. And beyond the initial shock of just the video, there is the fact that this is far from the first time that a Ukrainian refugee has been killed. The same week that Iryna was murdered, there was a Ukrainian refugee in the German city of Friedland who was pushed in front of a train by a 31-year-old man from Iraq who was apparently very drunk. Liana, the teenage Ukrainian girl, was from Mariupol. She was able to get away safely from hell on earth, only for the place that she found safety in not to be safe. A lot of this violence is not directed against Ukrainians. Iryna was not targeted because she was Ukrainian. Nowhere is safe, but it is nonetheless a tragedy. And sometimes they are targeted for being Ukrainian. There was one case of a Russian couple of German citizenship in Germany killing a 27-year-old Ukrainian mother and her own 51-year-old mother in order to steal the younger woman's baby. So just as the Russians are kidnapping and murdering in the occupied territories, this Ukrainian family who escaped to Germany had the same thing happen to them there. And in fact, they deliberately put themselves in contact with the Ukrainian refugee community in order to carry out this kidnap and murder by pretending like they were helping Ukrainian refugees. That's probably the most grisly story that I've heard, but it's pretty constant in a lot of places in Europe, especially Germany. A lot of these stories are coming out of Germany. Ukrainian refugees have been harassed and attacked, often by the Russian diaspora. but not always. So for those reasons, this would already be a horrible story of this young woman who escaped war only to be murdered in this very gruesome way. But what came next made everything so much worse. Because while we can look at this and see the tragedy as I just described, what a lot of the American right-wing media instead saw was a beautiful young blonde woman being viciously murdered by a black man. Every racist fear embodied in that one video. And suddenly, Iryna herself no longer mattered because now she was part of a racist morality play. So this image spread like wildfire throughout the right-wing media as this example of basically, some people were more direct in saying this than others, but basically saying that black people are animals and white people can't be around them or they'll attack our women. The same thing that has existed in every racist screed going back to the invention of racism. And a lot of the people who took up this cause are just fine with murdering Ukrainians. A lot of right-wing influencers who I've seen directly support the Russian invasion, others less directly so, who have no problem with Ukrainians being killed, have no problem with young Ukrainian women being murdered and dumped into a mass grave, or even mock them, say they deserved it for accepting George Soros money or something like that. And this woman, Iryna, who in any other circumstance they would be just fine with her being killed because they saw her as useful. Now she could be recruited to the cause because she's not a person to them. They spread lies about her and her family. They said that her dad was blocked from exiting Ukraine because Ukraine is so evil to all the men there that they can't even go to their own daughter's funeral. And that was a lie. He did. He went. He was able to go to the US. They presented this. There's a picture going around of her sitting at a friend's dorm room and that or apartment or something, and that had a picture of Black Lives Matter on the wall or something. And so, this Ukrainian, she didn't know any better because Ukraine doesn't have black people. She didn't know that they can't be trusted and are all violent and evil. And that's why she was able to sit next to one of them. And that is what did it. If you sit next to a black person, obviously you'll be murdered. Meanwhile, the family said, please stop doing this. Please stop trying to politicize the murder of their daughter. But of course, that doesn't matter because they don't matter because Iryna didn't matter to them. And the height of this cynicism is that at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, there's now a shrine to Iryna and Charlie Kirk, the American right-wing, also anti-Ukraine provocateur who was assassinated recently. But now, because these two events happened in close proximity to each other, now it's Iryna and Charlie Kirk who are the martyrs for right-wing America, the same America who wanted Iryna dead in the first place. And this cynicism, this detachment from reality, the disgusting AI generated videos of Charlie Kirk escorting Iryna to heaven and stuff. Like there's just something about this that even jaded, depressive me broke a little bit of something in. There is something extra disgusting about this whole affair. That Ukrainian life doesn't matter until they can pretend that it matters to do racism. Great. That said, the suspect in that case has been arrested. Again, severe schizophrenia, spent a lot of his life in and out of prison. His own mother didn't want him living with her anymore because he was impulsively violent. There are a lot of discussions that can be had about this regarding mental health, about incarceration in general, about serial violent offenders. Yes, there's a place for all these discussions, but instead what we got was just racism. But that is how I'm going to close out this episode. I had a little bit of something to say about the incoming school year. I'm going to bump that to the next episode because I'm trying to keep these shorter, and that is a whole other segment that I think deserves a lot of attention. So the next episode will be the beginning of my global polycrisis is the working title. I might decide to call it The Unwinding or something. I don't know. This series about the world coming apart next week will be the first episode of that. And then after that, for the next news episode, I will say a little bit of something about how the school year is already going in Ukraine. But a preview of that is that the very first week of school, many cities throughout Ukraine were bombed and could not hold classes for much of the time that was planned. So that was the basic thesis, ending off the episode. So thank you all for listening. As always, if you would like more resources to learn from, or the very common question of where good places to donate to, please see our link tree that is in the description. Again, I'll be putting some of these other projects in the description as well, from New Voice of Ukraine as well as to Radio Free America. But also, the best way to support the podcast is to tell your friends and family about us, get more ears listening, and especially with this new project coming up, I would like a bit more attention to it because I am putting a fair amount of effort, and the idea of a multi-part project is a bit intimidating. So positive reinforcement, please. And of course, if you'd like to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters, which includes access to our Discord server. So thank you very much to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Giorgio, David Shepard, Anna Kukratskaya, Mike, Michael Drucker, PLM, T. Bart, Barbara, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Jenny Louise, Marguerite, Kevin Alberton, Silas Frank, Dimitri Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Megan, Kyle Smith, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., Sanjay, Noam, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, Justin Devendorf, David Wall, Chris Bennington, Levy Grove, James Wise, Alex Crochmal, Aidan McDonald, Jerd, Victor Matei, Scott Tokaryuk, Etienne Soleil, Anna Cecilia, Captain Tentacle, Evelyn, Veronica, Matt Miller, Julie Louise, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Marianne, RDK, Francois, Lori Halila, Justin R., Christopher Yee, Kyle Johnson, Lemonikin, Dimitro, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noam Brown, and Dystopian Fiction, Praise the Remain Fiction, Marcus Nashkis, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Lewis Brown, Abel Lenz, Kiwi Valley, Kathy and Brent Irvine, Denna Jones, Joseph Berlone, and Yellow Duck. Thank you all very much for your support. You're what make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini!